Hey team, this is Brendan again. Before this begins and we talk to Naomi Snider, I just wanted to mention I've got one book out on Amazon called Cold Call Like a Comedian. You can check it out right now. There will be a link in the show notes for sale. $3 on Kindle version, or if you want to pick up a paperback, you can do that too for a few dollars more. This is about sales and comedy, basically just some things that I was musing about, talked about, and threw out. That have helped me in my sales career. Nothing relevant into what we're talking about today at all. And also, another one coming out, The Power Bible, co-written with William Beteet, the story of how he overcame his drug addiction and how I came back from being homeless to basically be doing comedy, this, and paying off all my debt in sales and the lessons we learned along the way. You can check out the list for that. You can sign up to get the first chapter for free at a link that will also be in the show notes. But neither of these happen to do with the subject we're talking about today with Naomi Snider, which is feminism, the patriarchy particularly, and why did the patriarchy persist. It's a great episode, and I was super happy to have her on the podcast. Without further ado, let's get over to that conversation. Thank you guys so much. The madness continues! Welcome to the Madness Continues podcast, where we talk to economists, entrepreneurs, comedians, porn stars, feminists, and people of all kinds. Every day I just try to break down what we're doing, why I'm here, and if I can make sense of this life.
Everyone's got baggage, everyone's got baggage, everyone's got everything to do. Drives me crazy, there's no one else.
It was nice to see you, though. I'm sorry that I couldn't figure out how to
Nice
do this
like
in person.
to a name, right?
Yeah. Yeah, our schedules have been kind of all over the place a little bit.
Yeah. It's been tough to. Well, because I think I said this to you the last time we spoke. I'm in my final year of training to become a psychoanalyst. So my time is I always think I have way more time than I do, but actually between seeing patients and a billion different supervisors and classes, it is a bit. It's difficult to coordinate with people. So yeah, at least we got to do this in some shape or form.
Yeah, you have you have a ton of irons in the fire. I feel like you between law school and psychoanalysis and publishing a book with a extremely relevant feminist author. I mean, I feel like you got all kinds of stuff going on.
Yeah. When you put it law school is a billion years ago, so at least that iron is out of that fire. But yeah, there's a lot that's going on, which is exciting, but it can feel very overwhelming. So yeah.
Well, so so thank you for being on the podcast. I should say we're recording. I'll just go ahead and yeah. It starts automatically. It's outside of my hands. It's just the way that the software works. But thank you for taking the time to be on the podcast, and and I just want to say, I guess at the beginning is this was really cool for me to be able to reach out, and I should say for the listeners who are picking up on this. Basically, what happened is I was wandering through. I recited this to you on the first time we spoke. I was wandering through the Strand bookstore in New York and saw the book, which is a bright yellow. I'll have a photo of it, or at least a link to it, on the show notes as well. It's a bright yellow, and it just says, "Why does patriarchy persist?" And then patriarchy is all crossed out with a crayon. And with a pink crayon. And so I saw it and immediately was like, "Wow, this is interesting." And picked it up, looked through it for a second, and then I thought I really need to dig into this. So I took a photo of it, and then ended up. Before, my habit lately is before I even jump in or dive into a book, I'll start Googling the authors and see if there's any talks that they've given online or anything. And I found two that you had given, I think in related to the book, and was really interested in what you had to say. I was like, man, this is really fascinating, and we'll get into kind of some of the content of this in a second. In terms of what you do have to say both in the book and I think in outside of it. And I just thought I really want to speak to some of what you had talked about, and this is before I read the book, really spoke to me, and I was like, I just really want to connect with Naomi about this, and was able to kind of hunt up an email, shot you an email, and you emailed me back, and which I was kind of surprised about, and you were like, hey, let's jump on a phone call real quick, and we had I think we talked for like almost an hour last time. About all kinds of different things, and then so I said, look, I'm going to go off and read the book, which I've done, and annotated the hell out of it. I should say, by the way, I've got like notes on almost every page of this thing, and that's where we are now. So we haven't spoken, and that was probably like a month ago.
Yeah,
it's amazing how time flies, especially in New York. And
that's only like a day in New York time.
It's so strange. I feel like there's people I meet, and like I'll go on the road for doing comedy, and I'll be like, yeah, I'm going to be gone for a week, and then they're like, oh, we'll never see you again. Like if you don't jump on something like right away, it's amazing if it ever happens in the city of New York.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you again for taking the time to not only to be on the podcast but to write the book and to have this conversation. And I think that just to start out with the thesis of the book, and I think we can kind of go from there a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The idea basically that you and Carol have in Why Does Patriarchy Persist that I think I found fascinating and resonated with me is that in order to participate in sort of the social system that we have around us, which you guys describe as patriarchy and is known as patriarchy, someone has to go through a kind of self-contorting process where they dissociate themselves from either thoughts or feelings that they have in order to kind of participate in kind of the marketplace of or social environment that we find ourselves in. And specifically, it seems like you arrive at that revelation through your own personal story, which you share in the book, and through the work of Bowlby, I think, who, without getting into too much academic detail, has done a lot of research on loss and dissociation and that entire world of psychology. Did I sum that up in any kind of accurate way, or am I missing anything?
No, you summed it up in a really great way, and because there's so many different ways of, like, from what perspective of, say, describing a thing, and I mean that's a good way into it. I like that way of describing it, that to kind of to participate in the marketplace of patriarchy, we have to contort and dissociate from crucial parts of ourselves. Yeah, I really like that way of putting it.
Well, so what I think is fascinating, you've written this book in a way that is kind of like, you and Carol is in a way kind of like how old Greek Athenian philosophers would write a book, which is the two of you have kind of different parts that you're speaking almost back and forth. So I feel like it's funny. I feel like I'm sitting in like a lecture where I'm like, there's you speaking, then Carol speaking, then both of you speaking, like in a chorus, which I think is kind of fascinating.
I love that you pick up that part of it, because actually it was so crucial to the writing of it, and I think kind of embodies precisely what patriarchy stops us from doing, because in a way it kind of speaks to that we come to know ourselves and what we think in conversation with others and in relationship with others, and by creating this kind of hierarchy and a set of rules that sort of stop you from saying what you really think and feel, it kind of both breaks off that relationship with other people, but then also a relationship with yourself. So it was only through conversation with each other that you can find a way out of that dissociation.
Well, and just to speak to that point, I mean, and many different points of the book, and I'm just looking at in the section on resistance. There's a whole bunch here where you and Carol both, I think you say here, actually this is on page 31, just in case anybody's following along at home, you say, I was foregoing a career in human rights. My self-contortion was socially rewarded. It's fascinating to me because the part that resonated with me most about this, and when I saw you speak online, was that this is very similar to, I think, my experience, as a boy and then as a young man, and I think is really I think this comes from, just so the listener understands, Judith. We just released the Judith Taylor episode, which is getting a lot of listens, and part of my interest in speaking with her, I think I mentioned to you briefly the last time we spoke, is that she was on the CBC and speaking about sort of the incel culture movement that's taking place online and all of the real world consequences of that. And I find myself very fascinated by this because there is a wholesale disassociative dilemma that's going on with young men, and particularly, I think, young white men, although it's affecting all young men, I think, it would seem, in Western cultures. And it feels like this, what you've identified, lines up very similarly to my experience as a young man. And also, there's many similarities, I think, in what you and Carol are describing to the kind of pathway that I ended up taking using things like the Mankind Project, through attempting to reclaim kind of almost a lost, disassociated personality. And it seems like a lot of the work that Carol's done and that you yourself have done has kind of lined up with that there's a, so for the listener to understand, and again, you can correct me, but there is this process we all have to go through. And for, as you mentioned in the book, for girls, this typically takes place in pre-adolescence. For boys, this takes place as young as 4 to like 7 years old, where girls are sort of asked, asked is maybe not the right word for it, but it's pressured, but the pressure, but here's the thing that I think is interesting about this. The pressure is sometimes disembodied, although it can definitely be embodied. And we'll talk about that in a second. But girls are pressured to kind of disassociate themselves from their, as I think Carol would put it, their sort of real voices, that they're authentic voices. Speaking things that they believe are true into the world, because the patriarchal social pressure that we find around us wants to pressure them into basically being silent partners in sort of the patriarchal environment that we're in. Would you say that's accurate? And then I'll move on to talking about boys in a second.
Yeah, they're pressured to kind of self-silence, to become these sort of selfless caregivers, so to speak on behalf of everyone else, but never to assert their thoughts and feelings. So yeah, and that's...
Okay, so okay, good. I'm glad I got that. So then the second part of this, which I think is really fascinating, is that boys are sort of taught and pressured at a younger age to dissociate themselves from really their feelings, almost wholesale, with the exception potentially of the feeling of anger or other sort of socially appropriate emotions. I believe at one point in the book there's a story that I think Carol delivers talking about how she was speaking on, someone else was sharing the story that there was a boy at home is able to appropriately display rage, but the young girl at home should not ever show rage. Like, that's not something that's ever.
I think that was taken from Bell Hooks.
That's right. Carol was
from her own experience growing up, that her younger brother was allowed, like, rage was permissible, but it was the only emotion that was allowed. And then for her, it was absolutely not allowed as a girl to express anger.
Yeah. I think this is fascinating to me because there's a number of different sort of things that have come up for me while reading the book. I think the first is that there is a strain in my own experience, and this is it's like I don't even know where to begin because there's so many things I want to talk about. But in my own experience with this, it feels like there's also a movement that can happen that Robert A. Glover describes in his book No More Mr. Nice Guy, that he calls the nice guy syndrome, which is something similar, which is that there are a certain number of boys who are pressured to also disassociate themselves from their feelings of anger or rage, that at some point in their young lives they get the message that those types of emotions are also not appropriate. And I think that what's fascinating to me is that particular strain of disassociating and silencing oneself feels like it can also just really confound this issue that there's a lot of men out there, grown men, I think, who probably are out of touch with their own feelings of anger, and it leads to a loss of powerlessness in their own lives. I feel like that's something that I experienced and had to go through a lot of work on in order to reclaim. And it's strange to me because it feels like I'm not sure, like I can appreciate almost the feeling that I had growing up is and I guess I'm sharing this with you just to hear what your thoughts are on this, having gone through this. But it almost feels like there's growing up, there's this this feeling of there is only one type of appropriate masculinity that is able to be displayed. There are lots of inappropriate types, but there's only one appropriate type, and that kind of performance is very difficult to do, and it leads to lots of people feeling completely, I think people, meaning young men, feeling rejected or dejected from being able to participate in any kind of community because it feels like they can't perform or they don't perform well that very specific type of masculinity. So sorry, that was a lot that I just dropped, but I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on this based sort of on your experience and with yourself, and then also kind of working through this in the book.
So, gosh, you said a lot, and it just had thoughts in relation to what you're saying. I don't know if there was was there a specific question that you had about it, or?
Yeah, I'm curious. So I guess my question is, you guys sort of talk about towards the end of the book solutions to kind of patriarchy and leaving patriarchy and things like this, but I get the feeling that we live in this, maybe another way to phrase this question is kind of that it feels like we live in this, we live in a social environment, which you guys describe as patriarchy, but that being true, it feels a little bit like that the performance that's asked of all the people, men and women who participate in it, can only look a certain type of way. And there are many ways that people don't perform that well. And that leads to all sorts of consequences. I'm thinking of eating disorders for young women, which are on the rise right now. I'm thinking of violent behavior for young men, which is becoming a total epidemic. I guess I'm thinking, what ways, in what ways does that happen? Why does it happen? And then what ways are there solutions for the young man or young woman listening to this, just especially based on your own experience, what are ways that you've kind of worked through this, or what ways can they potentially work through their own situations? Maybe this is too tall of an ask, but I'm just curious, what your thoughts are on people who are maybe dealing with their own dissociative disorders from having to go through the loss required to participate in sort of the social environment that we have. Does that make more sense? Sorry, that's a lot that I dropped on you.
Yeah, it does. I feel like there are two levels to what you're asking. I think one is like, what does this look like, this process? Because I think what you're pointing to is it doesn't look the same for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep.
And then if you're caught in it, what do you do with that? So just in terms of the process of initiation, I think that one of the things to say about it is that although there are clear rewards of compliance, it comes at a great cost for everyone. So and it's not like a stable kind of process either. It's not like, okay, so I was initiated into patriarchy and now I'm this patriarchal man, and it came at a cost, but also at a benefit because I claim all the power and privilege that comes with that. I think many of us often fall in and out of these states depending on the relational context that we're in. So I think it's like often a kind of complicated process. Mm-hmm. To speak to So to speak to the question, the part of your question about, well, what do we do about it? I think there are two levels at which this stuff works. I think there's the individual level,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is important to think about, which is we chart in the book that all of us have the capacity to resist these social pressures to contort and to conform. So even though for example, women who and again, I want to say this is like it's not. There are some women that comply with patriarchy, and there are other women that resist, and it's this binary difference. I think that there are shades, and actually I think that like many of us embody both in different parts of our lives. It's really easy to look at like the 51% of like white Republican women and that voted for Trump, and to say, okay, that is what patriarchy looks like today, when that's, I think, a quite extreme example of what it looks like, but on a kind of more, sometimes more subtle level. I think it's some of the examples that you're talking about. It's women who have, deny themselves the joy and the need of eating, because in some ways trying to make themselves smaller to claim a kind of to claim what seems like more power in the system becomes kind of such a cost when you think
that by so just to use that example specifically, by attempting to become smaller, by controlling what they're eating, they're playing a better role, so to speak, in kind of the patriarchal system that surrounds us. And by playing that role well, they're rewarded socially.
They're rewarded socially, but think about also the cost that comes at them, because it's embodied within that. I mean, there's such denial and such shame around need, desire, hunger. And so you're both compliant in some compliant, participating in a set of values and norms that are deeply harmful to yourself, and you're also communicating that message to other women, which is to say you gain power by making yourself smaller and sharper in these ways, that you can't be that you have to sort of deny something of womanliness to claim like a certain stature. I mean, I think it communicates many things, but I think it embodies that sort of your own needs and desires are inherently too much, too shameful, greedy. So I think there's a way of seeing it. I mean, it's many. I don't want to give a reductive view of what eating disorders are, because many things go into them, but I think you can see them on some level as an expression of something that is socially mediated, because there is a lot of social power and reward that comes with that disordered way of eating.
Well, so no, I mean, I don't think that there's a lot of things that go into eating disorders, but I think it's a good example. I would say like the opposite example, just as you were speaking, that came up in my mind would be for men, is that you at a certain point, I just think of athletes as a good example, that participating in let's say in like football or some other type of violent sport is really socially rewarded. I mean, I think of the stereotype in America is like, oh, it's the captain of the football team, get away with anything. Like, and people let him do anything because he's this kind of paragon of what this role is supposed to look like. And meanwhile, he's putting his body on the line. He's like, I mean, the number of athletes who have concussions, specifically in football, or receive all kinds of different injuries is really high, and it's a similar kind of thing. Not to mention, let's say, the contortions that guy has to do with his own feelings in order to receive that level of, let's say, social attention, or it's dissociation from the feeling of like, maybe I don't want to do X, Y, or Z today. It doesn't matter. You have to do these things because they're asked of you. I mean, again, it's not a one-to-one comparison, but that's kind of what comes up for me when you were speaking.
I think it's a great comparison, and I think what we're trying to get away from in the book is the idea of like zero-sum games, and that, I mean, clearly white men, white kind of rich men gain the kind of they get the most rewards in this system. I mean, that is undeniable and undisputable. You can just see the way that a certain kind of echelon of white men get all the rewards from the culture we live in. But I think it is important to see that within that, even to claim that status and privilege, there is an amount of contortion and denial and dissociation that goes to claim that place. And then it becomes quite a self-perpetuating system, because you're constantly having to deny and reprove who you are in order to hold on to that position. And the losses that have gone along the way can never be spoken of.
Yeah.
I think, like, if you another way of looking at the sports example is also to think about how at a certain point close, loving relationships between men become frowned upon. And the only way of really being able to experience that love and affection is through this very kind of macho, violent kind of camaraderie, which is, and I keep thinking during our conversation, because I went to a talk with the writers of the new book on Brett Kavanaugh, An Education of Brett Kavanaugh.
Ooh, yeah, from the New York Times writers. I forget.
Yeah,
fascinating
and
book.
Think of, like, even that horrific story of what happened to Christine Blasey Ford. From what she described of it, you really got the impression that she was just an object there. She was kind of a prop in a game that wasn't really about her. It was about these two men and then kind of some sort of currency at play for them to prove their masculinity to each other.
Yeah.
And I think I feel like so much of what we see in society is a kind of symptom of what gets prohibited among men and among women and between men and women. And so it creates really kind of sort of toxic systems, but it's all rooted. I don't think that I think the title of that book's perfect, because Brett Kavanaugh wasn't born Brett Kavanaugh. He had to be educated into that role, and and that education is a whole process of prohibition, punishment, and reward.
So okay, let's hold on. This is fascinating, because I think that this actually is I can see this as potentially a gateway into some bit of conversation that I wanted to have about the book and how it relates to, I think, everything you guys are discussing. To be honest, is that it's fascinating to me because one of the things that you've described in here is kind of this psychological movement that one must participate in for initiation into culture. And it feels like the education of Brett Kavanaugh is maybe a good example, because it's like, you're right, no one is born a Brett Kavanaugh, but there is some sense, I really want to speak with like Carol about this as well, because I'm fascinated because the mythopoetic men's movement, which took place sort of in the 90s, that was manifest in like the Mankind Project, which I went through, has a vocabulary similar to the kind of mythic vocabulary that that you guys are using in the book to describe this movement. Again, I mean, I'm sorry for the person listening, because we're sort of I can't recount every single mythic bit that you guys use, but you talk about Psyche, and Oedipus and a handful of different things like this. But there's this concept that comes from the mythopoetic men's movement, which is that there is a loss of an initiation ritual that has taken place in modern times. And men have always needed, since time immemorial, I say needed because have had an initiation ritual that has taken someone from you're a boy to now you're a man. And that it is meant to shepherd sort of boy psychology into male grown man psychology that is meant to hopefully inculcate a number of pro-social values and behaviors into the boys who go through, the adolescent young men who go through that process. And there's a lot that goes into there. That's a whole other thing we can walk through. But some of the authors like Campbell, maybe even Carl Jung, and certainly a lot of the people who write in the Myth of Poetic Men's movement, like Robert Bly and people like this, talk about the fact that we're in this, Robert A. Johnson, just another one who came to mind, talk about the fact that we're living in this culture that has lost this sense of self, and as a result doesn't know what sort of ritual needs to take place to shepherd in a healthy way boy psychology into man psychology. And as a result, we're left for the young to try to create their own rituals, and as a result, they're creating rituals such as, let's say, the education of Brett Kavanaugh, where women who would otherwise and should otherwise be treated as subjects and valued, people are treated as chattel or something like this.
I guess I mean, not knowing so much about the movement, but what I wonder is that harking back to kind of this mythological period where actually that was a really kind of like the idea being that process of boys to men was a really healthy process, and there weren't some of the harms that we see now, because I think actually that process that's being kind of memorialized is that very typical kind of patriarchal process where you become the boy that becomes the man, that becomes the warrior, that becomes the head of the household. And I think there have been real shifts in that, and I don't think that is a stable trajectory anymore. In fact, I'd say someone like Brett Kavanaugh, actually, I think his education probably mapped a lot of that trajectory of what it is to go from a boy to a healthy man. And I think throughout history, that's been a pretty problematic process. I don't think that. I think often it's been founded on war and on violence and on treating women.
Yeah, I think that this is probably a Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, but I guess, then a vacuum does open up, right? Because we are living in a time where men don't have the claim to all the kind of the security and the power and the privilege that trajectory once offered, right? So you get, I think, movements like the incel movement that's saying, hey, wait, we did all of that, and we're not getting the rewards that we were offered. And I think this is kind of what the book speaks to, is that with the breakdown of patriarchy, there is this opportunity to kind of have more authentic relationships. But that requires a level of vulnerability and openness that is shameful according to that patriarchal ideal.
Well, I think I think that, let me just interject a couple of different things, because I think that this is probably a part of where kind of, I think, an honest disagreement in the view of this might exist between us, is because my feeling is that when I look back, so the idea behind sort of initiation rituals, and without going into a quick and dirty explanation, I suppose, is that many of them, nearly all of them, hold similar movements, but do not always inculcate the same types of values. And when I think of when I speak historically, I'm speaking sort of very broadly in a grand sense, meaning that when not all cultures have the same type of let's say traditionally understood patriarchal values that I think you and I would recognize as like Western culture, especially modern Western culture and Western culture in recent history. I think of Ojibwe and Algonquin cultures where women were the mother, or like specifically the high priestess, is the most valuable person in social order. Sioux Indian culture is another example, and I'm sure that there are plenty of examples in the West, like ancient Celtic culture, that off the top of my head I can't specifically refer to. But I mean, who knows? I'm not a historian. I could be wrong about these things, but I guess the way that I look at that is that there absolutely has been a pathway that has existed in the way that you've described, which is inculcating an unhealthy masculinity. But some of that potentially could be the fact that these are just the results of life as they've been practiced historically, that we're entering a period of time in which the necessities of human life have no longer required the types of violence necessary that has in the past to protect itself from animals or other people or et cetera. And the type of work that needs to be done no longer requires lots of brute force and strength to in order to provide the necessities for living and continuing human existence. And in that space, patriarchy, which has traditionally been male dominated and held up, I think, men for a variety of reasons, no longer really needs to function in the way that it had to previously, because humans just no longer have a need for the types of specific biological things that men have, which maybe in time, in the deep past, it did need. I think that could be kind of a place of honest disagreement that we have, which is that, part of this that I find fascinating is that I think that patriarchy, and we can table this discussion maybe for another time, had existed out of a kind of necessity by just by, like I said, the way that human beings had lived. I've got lost in speaking, and what was your second point? I'm so sorry.
You were speaking about these initiation rituals as maybe, I'm guessing from your experience that you didn't feel that they were always, that they were maybe healthy in some ways, that they offered something that was important.
Yeah.
I guess this is the thing that Carol and I what our book speaks to, and I think.
I remember my second point. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, go on.
The second, because the part of that I think was valuable for me is, as somebody who I think at one point in my life had harbored a lot of anger towards, I think, women, and look, if the incel culture had been around when I was like 19 or 20, I feel like I would have maybe identified with it, which is a terrifying thought to have for myself. But I think that part of that reason,
it's important to recognize, right, and to think about what. Okay, I think that's more honest than a lot of people would be to admit that.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. It's funny. When I shared this with Judith Taylor, she said something very similar, and I think that. I think that I would have probably done that, but part of the reason I would have done it is I think that I had felt that what I had wanted, which was a kind of socially recognized validation place in the look, and this is a result of, I think, an uninitiated male, boy psychology, which is that what there is a dominant narrative socially that is, you get a woman, you get a girl, you get love, you get affection, you get sex when you are a valuable person within the social hierarchy.
I would say that is precisely the initiated voice. I think it's the most basic thing that we all want recognition. It is that is one of the most basic relational things that we all have. We want to be seen and understood and known. And then we basically get initiated into this culture that says the only way for you to have those things that you want is to wear this mask. And paradoxically, wearing that mask means you're never really seen and known for who you are, but you're given enough recognition, right? You're given the status. You're basically told who you are. If anyone sees that, you'll be laughed at. But wear this mask and you'll have a certain type of social recognition. I think that longing, that desire it's rooted in something that's basic to all of us, but that is the contortion. And I guess just to say, I don't think that's the uninitiated voice. I think that is the initiated voice that says, oh, I want recognition, and my way to get it is to get a girl, to be captain of the football team, to earn this amount of money. Like, I think that is the initiated voice.
So this is interesting because I definitely see what you're saying. I would say that is an improperly initiated voice, but it's interesting because in the Mankind Project, I just, again, based on my own experience being a member of sort of a handful of different men's groups like this, what, my perspective in learning it is basically that when there is no healthy mentor to, like I said, shepherd someone into this kind of more healthy pro-social male psychology, you kind of are meant to cobble together whatever it seems like the dominant social narrative is. And the dominant social narrative is an unhealthy one, as you've just described. It's fascinating because I feel like in my own experience, I was challenged by this group of men to be like, look, you need to take ownership of the fact that you want connection. You want, you want to experience love and affection and affirmation from people. These are things you need to ask for.
I see that as more of a rehabilitation project than an initiation project. I think that like little boys, like little girls, like all of us are born with that knowledge that we want to connect. We know it, and it gets like knocked out of us. So I don't think it's like you need a mentor to teach you that stuff. I do agree. I think that in order for those desires and those skills to thrive, you need a relational context in which they can. So I think a mentor type figure or peers like that kind of can allow that, I think is vital. But I don't think it requires you to, I mean, maybe if it's been knocked out of you, you have to relearn it. But I don't think it's teaching you something that you didn't know from the beginning, that you that got kind of pressured out of you.
See, this is another area that I feel like maybe we disagree on. Is it's because I feel like you you guys make this point in the book, and I think it's a good one in the sense that I think that there is something genuine that is, young girls express how they feel. There's the trope of the precocious, young girl for a reason. And I look at my own family and think about my nieces and cousins, and they will tell you exactly what they think when they're 7 years old. And I think in my own family, I love it in them. I love that movement, and I don't want them to lose it. And it's interesting to hear Carol say later in the book, well, then I guess you're in the progressive, social progressive, like now you have to be a kind of progressive in participate in this because that's a political concept. I think that's probably true. I guess, but drawing back, there's a feeling that the belief, at least in the the mythopoetic men's movement, which I keep referring to, is that there is that is true that there are those things that are there, but those are also selfish desires from children, which is that the desire to feel human connection with another person comes from a selfish place, and it also comes from a selfless place, or a place that has to be initiated or properly what's the word I'm looking for? Like, there is a healthy pro-social way to get that feeling, and there's an unhealthy way to get that feeling. And in many ways, the unhealthy way is the way the child would go about it. That if I cry and wail because I want my mother to pick me up, it's an expression of a loss and disconnection, but it is also a misrecognition of the fact that, look, your mom has to go to work. She's dropping you off at this place because she has to go to work, and it sucks, but that's just the way sort of the necessities of life are in a certain kind of way. I wonder, how much of, and so just to back up a little bit further, because I agree, I very much agree with the points that you're making here, and I think that they're on one level, I'm reading this book and I'm like, oh my God, everything in this, it speaks to me. I can see it. It speaks to my own experience. But I think on another level, I think to myself, how much of the patriarchy that we're dealing with today, the sense of loss as you've described in the way that, you've worked out through Bowlby's work, et cetera, is a result of the fact that we're left with this kind of human software that social software that's old. I mean, we're in a version of social software that's maybe 30, 40, 50 years old that needs to be updated, is working through maybe the process of being updated. But also hardware that's been bequeathed to us after 10,000 generations of humans that, it part of the deep primordial past, boys had to accept that it might be them who has to go do something scary like fight off a bear or a mountain lion or another person in order to protect their family and their loved ones and all of these things. And at 6 or 7 years old, that's already not too late for them to have to make that dissociative move, because a very sensitive boy is not necessarily the best guy to be like, let me go grab a spear and stop this mountain lion from wandering into our camp or whatever. I know that I'm being a little bit ridiculous. I can almost feel people listening to this and like rolling their eyes at this story that I've sketched. But I'm curious just what your thoughts are to respond to kind of the whole host of things I've just kind of vomited up here.
Well, I think there are two things that you're saying. One, I think we could kind of probably be less at loggerheads if we didn't get so kind of caught up on the question of, like, it feels like a semantic debate to some extent. I think where we do agree is that there are certain relational cultural contexts that allow our innate relational capacities to be cultivated and to be cultivated in healthier ways. And there are other environments that stop that process from happening. So I think, if we step away from, is that initiation or not? Like, we could, kind of probably find that we're not, I guess words can sometimes make us seem like we're further apart than actually we are. But I think there is actually a crucial question that you're raising, which I think is a matter of debate. And I think we are looking at it from a different perspective. I think you're raising the idea that, look, these are, whether it's whether it's because of evolution and the way that our psychology has grown in the context of the millennia of years that we've lived in, where men have had to be hunter-gatherers, blah, 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 that actually we need a rewiring.
Yeah.
So that
and I think I think we're way closer than we think. Yeah.
I think you don't need to argue that point much, because I think that is pretty much the common view, is that, look, these are just the way that men are, women are, we've been for, and there's some kind of, the desire to dominate, for power, for all those things is kind of something that we have to learn to, Freud would say this, right? It's a process, there's a healthy repression that happens in order to live in a society.
Yep.
So I don't think that your view is that surprising, or I think most people would agree with it. I think we're offering a different perspective that says, okay, what about this? And then, I mean, without wanting to get into the nature nurture debate, because it's
let's step past it. Yeah, I also don't know if it's a very productive debate to have, to be honest, because we're who we are, you know. Right? Yeah. Well,
we're social beings. We're born. How will we ever know what's culture and what isn't? But what we can. But what I guess what we're trying to open up through infant research and through research on boys and girls development is actually these capacities for maintaining connection, which is neither selfless nor selfish. It contains an element of both, and that dialectic between the two is the essence of relationship. It's neither completely for the other person and for myself. There's this negotiation of two people's interests, and how can we balance and allow for both? That is, I think, what we describe as the essence of a democratic relationship, which is in contrast to a patriarchal relationship, or matriarchal, whether it's men on top and women below, or women top, men below, you have the same dynamic at play, which is like whenever our interests are not aligned, one of us is going to have to win out on the other. It's a process of domination or submission. And what we say actually is when you look at infants and when you look at young boys and young girls, is that in healthy relational contexts, they're able to negotiate that space between themselves and the other person. That ability to say what I think and then pick up on what the other person thinks and negotiate that is inbuilt, because in fact that's what's crucial to human survival, is the ability to assert our needs and to pick up on the feelings of those around us. And so when you look at what happens in the process of, in order for then to maintain a system of hierarchy, you have to knock out those relational capacities. Because if people on top are having empathy towards people below them, then there's no way they're going to maintain that system of injustice and oppression that doesn't listen to the people below them. Similarly, if you're on the bottom, if you can assert what you really think and feel, that also is going to upset the hierarchy. So you have to knock out those relational capacities. And that's what we see happen when boys get shamed for expressing any emotional sensitivity for other people. It knocks out their ability to hear what other people think and feel. And girls, when they lose that capacity to assert themselves, their relational capacity of self-assertion is also destroyed. So I think the solution isn't, and I think it's important to recognize that it isn't that they are difficult, like it's not a simple process. Being in real relationship with people is painful. It's risky. It's like the only system where you don't have open conflict is a patriarchal system, because there's the voice of authority and everyone else needs to submit to it. In a society where everyone has a voice and they can say what they think and feel, conflict will abound, but you have the fundamental ideal that you care about other people's view in that conflict. The aim is not to win, it's to assert, it's to express your own needs, have them seen, and also to hear the other person's needs. And I don't think it's so much that we need to. What we show is that relational hardwiring we have, it is there and it gets knocked out of us. So how can we create a culture and a society and relationships that are more in sync with and in tune with those skills and those needs,
that allow maybe that dissociative loss that has to take place to not happen or happen, such that women can still feel like they have a voice and men can still feel like they can be vulnerable, caring, emotive.
We say that the first response to loss is not dissociation. Dissociation is a kind of is a defense against loss, and it serves some functions, but only when you've had an experience of irreparable loss. So the first response is the attempt to restore the connection, and it's only when we lose faith in that process that we go to dissociation, to silencing. And I think, to go back to the incel movement, I think that they really reflect this process. Like, so say you have the mythological man's movement, and then you have the incel movement. And it sounds from your experience of the mythological man's movement that it created a space for healthy protest, where you could express all the things that you didn't have, that you wanted to have, maybe the feelings of insecurity, and you were able to forge authentic, responsive connection with other men, and therefore with women.
Yeah, I think that's fair, because I think I think that's a fair analysis.
And we discussed the anger of hope versus the anger of despair. So let's say that represents the anger of hope, where there is anger there because there's a loss of connection that you want. And then you have the anger of despair, which is like a malignant, rageful hatred, hateful anger. And I think you can see that play out in the incel movement. But so we have two diametrically opposed responses to a very similar experience of disconnection and loss. And even though it may seem like the incel movement is the outlier here, I think in some way they represent this kind of patriarchal model of masculinity in its most kind of ugly, violent, brutish mode. I think it shows what patriarchal manhood looks like when it's under threat, and that it rests on a lot of dissociation, on
dominance.
The need to assert one's like one's own needs, and like, you know, women don't matter at all, they're just objects. A lot of denial of a hurt that's underlying.
Well, I think that it's a grab bag of you know, of terrible things, I think, in that space in many ways. I guess I feel so. First of all, I feel like all of what you've described is actually, I think, is a pretty good encapsulation of, I think, the experience that I had going through sort of the Mankind Project. In many ways, I feel like this conversation, you must be like, Jesus, this is like a free therapy session I'm giving this guy. But
wait, well, what makes you say that?
Because I feel like we're working through a lot of, you know, this is a lot of stuff that I feel like I have worked through or worked through, and in many ways it's kind of, you know, these types of issues, men and women relating to each other, relating to oneself. This is all personal. It is also social.
It is. I mean, I think that if we don't speak about it in a personal way, it becomes just abstract and
dry, very dry.
And I think it is. I mean, like from my perspective, this is something that it's really difficult for me to talk about this stuff because I struggle with it every day. I mean, there's the added difficulty in speaking about it because I feel like the expectation is you write a book on patriarchy, so therefore somehow you're above it all, and you found your voice, and you can see when these things are going on and speak out. Like, no, I'm constantly wrestling with this stuff in a very personal way. So I appreciate that you come to this from like a personal lens of like struggling with it, because I think that is part of the way out, is to be more open and honest about the way that we all struggle with this stuff.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, because I think that, you know, you said earlier, and Judith Taylor, the professor of women and gender studies at the University of Toronto, who I interviewed recently, said something similar, which is like, thank you for being honest with the fact that this is like a problem that you struggled with. I think that, you know, for men who are in the incel community, which like I said, is a grab bag of sort of, there can be a grab bag of really malignant issues that come from that section. But I think that they're dealing with a lot of things, but one of them is that there's this hallmark of unhealthy masculinity, which is that you cannot admit that you have a problem. Like like socially, you can't be like, wow, I'm really lonely and that hurts. And just admitting that to yourself and to the world around you opens the door for you to be able to even begin to address that issue. And I think that that's a real problem. I think that in many ways, the incel community shows what happens when there is no pathway to a healthy masculine identity. That, you know, I think that there's a lot of, I guess I have sympathy for that community, because I can see, there's a lot of men who are struggling. No one would choose to be living this way.
I think the problem is that they reflect the fact that patriarchy is always, you know, the way they speak, that they're the alphas, and they're like really hard on themselves for being the like scum, whatever. That they all like, they want to keep the system though. It's like there's this And I think,
I think that because you've identified it in your book, is that I think that because they want to the pathway to success for them is climbing the hierarchy such that they never have to be vulnerable, yet can experience all the things that they want in their life. And like
it's a myth.
Yeah, it's a myth. And if I was going to write a dating book, it would, the 90% of the advice would be like, hey, take responsibility for your own life, okay? And that doesn't mean that you're going to have to be, or that you're going to get everything you want and not have to be vulnerable or take risks or get hurt. Just accept those things as part of this process. And within 6 months, you'll be able to have a healthy relationship with, a woman, because you're going to have to work through these issues or something.
I want to go back to the point that you made before. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but
go ahead.
You quoted, like, you half quoted this guy, but you were saying it from your own perspective. So Carol, I think, writes in the book about this man who says he's got a 7-year-old daughter. And he says, similarly to what you were saying, she's so outspoken, and I love that about her, and I don't want her to lose it. And Carol says, well, okay, then you're going to be in the game of social activism, because for her to retain that voice, she's going to be coming up against a culture that in order for her to become a good woman, she will have to silence that voice. And so you're going to have to be not only encouraging her to come into resistance with the culture, but you're also going to have to challenge a lot of those cultural norms. I think the same can be said for your dating book. I think that if it's at that point, it stops just being a dating book. Those men are coming then into a form of political resistance. They're resisting a culture that says, in order to succeed and to be to succeed in the world, in order to be loved by a woman, in order to be valued, you have to conform in all of these ways. And if they don't conform, I think that there's a reality that they are coming into resistance and there will be pushback.
I think that that's correct, and I think that part of what is so challenging about that particular movement, and I think for men and men in the incel culture, not to pigeonhole this conversation in this direction, but it's just something that I think is top of mind for me, both because it's in the world and also just due to my own experience, is that something that's difficult for them is that I don't think that they're inaccurately assessing their situation. I think that. In my experience, being emotive with a lot of women it frightens them, and I think that they're not used to the idea that there's a man who's willing to be vulnerable and ask for something that he wants, or say that he's afraid, or any of these things. And I think that I think that actually is very frightening to a lot of women who are not used to the idea that I get to be the emotional one and he gets to be the stoic one. And I think that it's strange because there's a whole group of, sensitive men. It's almost like there's this divide in the male community where men who have any type of sensitivity become nice guys, and a certain percentage of them become incels. And then this other group of guys who goes the other way and becomes Brett Kavanaugh's. And, none of that is healthy. But I think that there's this like sort of shadow spot, which is that, there are a lot of men who I think accurately assess that they're like, when I tell when I see a woman who I'm in contact with, maybe she's in a class of mine, maybe I work with her, maybe I whatever, and I want attention from her, I want to give her attention. Maybe it's as innocent as that far. It's like it already gets disrupted because I don't, not only do I not know how to do that, but then when I go do that in my poorly articulated way, in a vocabulary I don't have, it immediately, I get the feedback that I'm not wanted or not needed, or that those things are frightening to her, and I don't know where to go with this. I think that I guess this is way off.
And another side of it, right, which is on the one hand, I think there's two ways of looking at it, and there's an element of truth to both. That, is there, in part of that narrative, is there an expectation, hey, look, I was vulnerable, I opened up, now you should you should listen. Like there could be many reasons why that person doesn't want to have that interaction with them.
Totally.
Just because we open up and we're vulnerable and we're emotional doesn't mean we have the right for that person to be responsive to us.
Yep.
On the other hand, I think that there is a part of that that's speaking to something that we're talking about in the book, which is maybe that that's part of the pushback that some men will receive, that we've all been initiated into this culture where some women maybe a man does express their emotions and they're like, oh, no, not so much. I want my stoic man. I'm sure that is a reality that some men face, and it's like, okay, how can you navigate that as a reality and still hold on to your emotionality without kind of wanting to turning to anger and blame of that woman, but maybe seeking out other relationships that are going to be more responsive to your needs.
I think you've captured it. I think that, the word entitlement came to mind. It's funny because I've been reluctant to use that word a lot, but after speaking with Judith Taylor, I'm like, I think that there is a certain sense of like, oh, I do this, then I get this. I mean, this is one of the things Robert Glover identified in his No More Mr. Nice Guys book, is this concept of covert contracts. Like I think that a lot of men in the incel community feel betrayed in a kind of way because they feel like they're like, I've done all the things I feel like I'm supposed to do. And strangely, I think that I don't know this at all, but when I hear, just hear accounts of men and women interacting, especially young women, men and women interacting, years ago, like in the 50s and things like this, I think that there was a kind of strange transactional nature to the relationship. And I think that was kind of understood, and which is strange. I mean, I obviously can't speak with any authority about this, but like, I think that one of the things that's confounding in this is we've entered this time period in which these rules are changing. The space is changing.
It's really destabilizing and scary, and I think it's also the opportunity for to go in two directions. With that shift, it opens up for something that is so much more. Let me think of the right adjective for it. So much more meaningful and nourishing.
Yeah, nourishing. There you go.
Nourishing is a good one, right, for this. It's like, okay, there was something, there was a payoff with the transaction, but there was a cost to both. I mean, if you look at the number of 1950s housewives on Prozac and probably men with alcohol problems, there's a reason why the women's liberation movement occurred.
Yeah.
There was deep, underneath that compromise is deep loss and sadness. So with this shift in the culture, there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's the possibility of rewriting the rules and having something that is so much less sure and certain. Like if there's a transactional model, we all know the rules we play by and the apparent payoff. Real relationships don't function that way. They're really uncertain and dangerous, but there's the joy of okay, but I'm in this real relationship with this person. I get to express myself and explore what I really think and what I feel. Or we can go in the other direction, which is to really try and double down and to go back to this old system where there are rigid rules and roles that we play, and apparently, if you play it right, you'll get this payoff that I think works for some, and I think there's a big amount of mythology in. I don't think everyone was rewarded in the same way.
No, I mean I agree, and I think that going back is not going to happen. I don't think it's possible to do that
right now in the way our culture's going. I think you've got a moment where I think you're seeing this in the US, I think you're seeing it in the UK, I think you're seeing it in other countries where it's the politics is going in two directions, towards a more kind of socialist, egalitarian ethos, which is kind of pushing back against racial, gendered, sexual hierarchies, class-based hierarchies, and then you're also at the same time having these conservative movements that in many ways are trying to reinstall a very kind of traditional, patriarchal, racially hierarchical system. And I think that they're the two directions our culture's going in at the moment. And
yeah, I really think that. I mean, let's table the former the discussion of the social sort of traditionally leftist side of that for a moment, because there's a whole thing we can go into. But my view on the right side of it is that this is the last dying gasp of something that is trying desperately to cling to
I hope you're
relevance.
right.
I mean, I think really that is what's happening, and it's producing its production of monsters like Donald Trump is an example of that. The guy is a fucking buffoon, and anybody with 2 cents can see it.
You know what troubles me more, I think, if I'm really honest, is that you are right, but that somehow the framework, this framework of domination and submission, we end up, the movements that were kind of pushing towards something different than that system, like whether it's like, let's like shortcut it, like on the left, that we end up. What's the Audrey Lorde quote? You can't break the master's house using the master's tools.
It's so weird. I have a essay on my desk by Audrey Lorde right now. I just looked over at it. That's so weird.
Ultimately, what we're talking about here is like, if you get away from patriarchy, it's like the gendered, it's men above women. It is essence what it is a set of tools that say, here's how you resolve conflict, and here's how you have relationships. It's through the splitting of roles. And it's basically through domination and submission. And as long as you're in that framework, you're in a hierarchical system. And so I think that what troubles me most is how can systems of resistance embody different tools that don't come through that like shaming and silencing, and dominance and submission as a mode
of practice. Yeah, it's fascinating because I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think that I'm a big fan of Slavoj Zizek, and one of the things that he preaches is that hierarchies are spontaneously created by humans, that there's no, this is something our mind places on in the world, and we have to go through almost contortions in the way you described in a different direction in order to try to model a system where dominance and submission are not the case. I think that part of what's confounding in this discussion, and we'll just have to table it for now due to time restrictions, is that I think that people on the right, my family's a good example of this. I've branches in both sides of the political spectrum and the class spectrum, to be honest. But I see that people on the right accurately, I think, see that the left has a desire for dominance and submission that the right, I think, is afraid of. That cancel culture is sort of like part of this, and I wonder if like what the pathway forward is. There's almost needs to be some kind of truth and reconciliation, like movement for all people to kind of
truth and reconciliation rather than an end, like where now we've so I think there has to be a model that moves forward with truth and reconciliation as a kind of model for how we exist in the world with each other, because we're not always going to be on the same page and have the same perspective on things. So how do we negotiate that?
I think
to me that's the scariest question, like the kind of most important and challenging.
I think we'll probably have to leave it there today, just due to time restrictions. But
I actually really have to go.
Yeah, I know, me too. I just want to say, Naomi, thank you so much for taking the time to do this and for helping, for staying in fidelity to the conversation as we attempted to work through, what I thought were, a couple of different parts of honest disagreement, some of which I think was semantic, as you described, but and
I think I feel like in a way I'm glad that rather than skirting around because I think we have a lot that we agree with, and I think there are these kind of tensions, and I'm glad that that's in a way what we focused on, because I think that is sort of modeling something about what a kind of different system could look like, where we can actually both say, you know what, I don't completely agree with you on that thing. Here's my perspective.
Yeah, and stay, stay through to I think some productive conversation at the end, which I think was great. I just want to say again, this book, Why Does Patriarchy Persist, is a fantastic book. I would recommend everybody read it. It is very good, and it's certainly thought provoking and very well founded. I mean, the notes that you and Carol have underpinning the research you've done and to support a lot of these cases is amazing in and of itself, and probably will keep me tied up between now and the end of the year sorting through a lot of that. But
yeah, I would really recommend I know you wouldn't wrap this up, but there are two that in terms of the work on boys' development, When Boys Become Boys and Deep Secrets, two different books, and we reference a lot of them, but that really look at the process of initiation for boys, and I think it'll be really interesting reading.
I'll have to go check that one out myself. Yeah. Expect an email from me about that one when I finish reading it. Where can anybody listening? Where can they? Obviously, I'll link the book so they can go purchase and check it out. But if anyone wants to follow anything that you're producing or doing in the world, can they follow you on Twitter, or where can they find you?
You can follow me on Twitter, and also we have a website, which is www.whydospatriarchypersist.com.
Okay, great. Naomi Snider, again, thank you so much for being on The Madness Continues.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.